So, what I want to do with you all today for our Torah Tuesday, there actually isn't a Torah portion for this Shabbat because this Shabbat happens to be Shavuot. It's the second day of Shavuot. So instead of looking at this week's Parsha, which doesn't exist, I want to take a look at something pertaining to Shavuot. In this case, I'm actually going to use the group of you as my guinea pigs for the teaching that I'm preparing for Thursday night. So, that's going to be with a lot of communities coming together, and this is the first time I'm teaching this as a concept. So I'm hoping that maybe you can help me, refine it a little bit as well. It's a pretty finished product as it is, but just want to make sure that it's nice and tight. And of course, you can still participate on Thursday night in my session, but it also then frees you up. If you wanted to come to my session, you'd be able to go to any of the other, many other sessions that are going on at the same time. So that's what we're doing today. So let me pull up the text I want to share with you all. And here we go. All right, so the text that we're looking at, actually let me change the settings here. Okay, so the text itself, the title of the class is Honey from the Rock, Addressing Our Trauma to Reveal the Torah Within. And I'm going to go all the way down to the very bottom because I think I actually want to start here. If you download this text from the website, if you download the PDF, these are the last two pages that we're looking at right here. So, for those who aren't aware, and I know those who are here regularly with Mishkon are probably aware, but this past year was a difficult year for me. Right? I experienced some serious trauma, and I took some time to address that trauma, to try to treat my PTSD, and it was a very profound experience for me. So I thought I want to take a look at how that might present itself within our tradition. And I realized that the entire process of the Omer, moving from Pesach to Shavuot, is really a beautiful example of this process. Because really, in its essence, Pesach is all about trauma. Right? Pesach is about escaping trauma. It's about getting away from it, at least getting it to stop. And we know this. It's all about the slavery. It's about the killing of all the babies. It's about just all the oppression that we experienced in Egypt. And really, the beginning of the story of us as a people really begins with this text right here from Exodus chapter 2. At the very end of chapter 2. This is Moses has left Egypt. He's living in Midian, and it says God heard their moaning. This is God hearing the Israelites crying out, and God remembered God's covenant with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them. And so this is really the very beginning. God sees and hears that we are suffering, that we are going through this trauma, and God wants to help in any way that God can. So we start there, and then we get to the very to the end of this, to Shavuot. Shavuot's going to be about Torah, and we'll get there in a moment. But I just want you to see some of the other texts that are associated with Pesach. So here we have the main central text from the Haggadah. There are 5 verses that all the rabbis are expounding upon throughout the Haggadah. That's really the bulk of the Maggid. All right, so my father was a wandering Aramean, a fugitive Aramean, went down to Egypt. There became a great and populous nation. The Egyptians dealt harshly with us and oppressed us. They imposed heavy labor upon us. We cried to Adonai, the God of our fathers, and Adonai heard our plea and saw our plight, our misery and our oppression, and Adonai freed us from Egypt by a mighty hand, by an outstretched arm and awesome power. Right? But here again, the story that we're telling ourselves, and this is distilling our story down into just a few verses, several verses. It is about this trauma that we experienced down in Egypt. And even where we see this language a lot, it's just about, when we have the four children, and when time comes, your child asks, what does this mean? You shall say to him, it was with the mighty hand that Adonai brought us out from Egypt, from the house of bondage. Like this idea of bondage and slavery, we talk about this all the time. And then we get to receiving Torah. So it's the very first thing that God says to us as a collective, not just to Moses, but to all of us. The very first thing God says to all of us is, I am Adonai your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage. That's the first thing. That's the very first commandment that God says to us. So Torah that we get on Shavuot is very much tied to the trauma of Pesach. So the question is, but how do we go from that trauma to Torah, to this relationship with God? And so I'm not going to go through these others, but we see both times we have the Ten Commandments. The very first thing is the same line is repeated. And then even in the very end of the Shema, God says, I am Adonai your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I, Adonai, am your God. These are the things that we say to ourselves all the time. And we're always reminding ourselves about this. So the question is, how do we go from one to the other? So what I want to do is I want to take us through a couple different stories. And I actually have them in a weird order here, because I'm, again, still refining this. But we're going to just go to the story of Joseph. So this is going to be page 4 of the PDF if you download it yourself. Before I do continue, any questions up to this point? No questions at all. Okay, great. So, so we're looking at the story of Joseph. 1 second, Phil. I'll let somebody in. I'll let Aaron in. All right, yeah, Phil.
So, in a sense, it's almost like a metaphor. I mean, the freedom, the trauma that we experience in Egypt. You also experience a couple of personal traumas in your own life, and then you're going from that to receiving the Torah as the people of Israel were freed from Egypt. What are they going to do with their freedom? And they receive the Torah to give them guidelines. So I'm trying to get that equation a little bit clearer on how it relates to your PTSD. I'm sorry.
That's the whole purpose of the shiur. So just hang tight. I'm going to take you through this whole process. How do we go from one to the other? Okay. So I want to present 2, possibly 3 examples of this process. How we go from me'avdut lecherut. How are we going to go from the lowness of slavery, that trauma of slavery, to this new Torah. However, we're going to understand Torah here. So the first example I want to give chronologically is looking at the story of Joseph. So we all know the story of Joseph, right? His brothers did not like him. They picked on him and they left him out of everything. And then one day he comes along when they're all out in the fields near Shechem, and they decide to kill him. And they said, no, let's not kill him. We don't derive any benefit from that. So let's at least try to sell him. So they throw him into a pit. And when he's in the pit, right, they're trying to figure out what they're going to do. And somebody else, the group comes and takes him out. They sell him into slavery. He's working in slavery. He's doing pretty well for himself. And then he's thrown into prison. And then he's in prison and he's doing well for himself in prison. And he's brought out of prison. And Pharaoh makes him second in charge of all of Egypt. Right? So this kind of tumultuous life. And obviously there are a lot of highs in his life as well, but there are obviously a lot of lows too. Right? Being thrown into a pit, having your life threatened, being sold into slavery, being thrown into jail, those are outrageous traumas that the vast majority of people never have to experience. And those who do experience even one of them, that's a lot. Right? And here you have one on top of the other, and he rises up from it. But does he really rise up from it? And we see that when his brothers first appear, this is 9 years after, it's not exactly 9 years. He was working for a little while, but it's been quite a while since he's seen his brothers. So he's sees them, and he doesn't reveal himself to them. He tests them, and he's still kind of uncertain about them. What's going to go on here? And finally, after everything's all said and done, we get to this text right before us. This is chapter 45 of Genesis. This is from Parshat Vayigash. So it says, Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, "Have everyone withdraw from me." So there was no one else about when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. His sobs were so loud that the Egyptians could hear, and so the news reached Pharaoh's palace. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still well?" But his brothers could not answer him. So dumbfounded they were they on account of him. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come forward to me." And when they came forward, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, he whom you sold into Egypt. Now do not be distressed or reproach yourselves because you sold me hither. It was to save life that God sent me ahead of you. It is now 2 years that there has been famine in the land, and there are still 5 years to come in which there shall be no yield from tilling. God has sent me ahead of you to ensure your survival on earth and to save your lives in an extraordinary deliverance. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. And God has made me a father to Pharaoh, Lord and of all his household, and ruler over the whole land of Egypt." Okay, so what's going on here? How is Joseph kind of coming to terms with his trauma? Just the hands of, yeah, Phil.
Well, I with all due respect, Rabbi, I think there's an important part of the story that comes just before Joseph does that gives him the impetus to do it, which is when, is it Reuben, is willing to sacrifice his own life for Benjamin. He says, "Please take me, not Benjamin." And I think you need that piece in there because something happened. There was an important, that all of a sudden Joseph realized that his brothers either had changed or that, so I think there was that moment.
Right, so it was Judah who did it.
Judah.
And really the 4 chapters leading up to this all kind of are telling this whole story, right? It's all about him kind of testing the waters with his brothers. He sees them, he knows who they are, he sends them back to Canaan to grab Benjamin. They bring Benjamin down, he tests them again, wants to throw Benjamin in jail. It's like this, all these tests. And what he's doing, he just wants to see like what is happening with him. And when he finally realizes that it's not the same anymore, right? He's able to kind of reveal himself, right? So what I personally see happening here is that he doesn't run from it, right? He faces his brothers. He wrestles with them. They may not realize it, but he's wrestling with them to see like who are they at this point. He's trying to really get a sense of what's going on. And when he finally faces it head on, sees what he needs to see, in a way, he finds God in this moment. Right? He finds God in saying, well, God wanted this to happen, which is a difficult theology, I think, for a lot of people. But for him, that's what worked. He said, yeah, things might have been difficult for me, but you know what? In the end, it all worked out. And not only did it all work out, but I've actually been positioned in a way to be able to help the rest of my family, to help you all survive so that you don't die. So there's this really kind of profound 180 that he makes. And we're not sure if he's going to do that, right? When the brothers first show up, we're not sure if he's going to do it. And he doesn't cry right away, but it's when he starts realizing what's happening and realizes that, he faces this trauma. He's actually looking at his brothers, his attackers, and he's come to terms with who he is and who they are, and realizing something's in the past, and realizing that he came out of it all right. He's able to then gain this new perspective, and his new perspective is saying that God, everything's happening as God's purpose. But that's how he's walking away from it. Any questions or challenges? Yeah, Carol.
I read this, and at first my feeling is that, Joseph is sincere. And then there's a part of me that's becoming a little more cynical these days. And I wonder, how sincere is he really? And is there some hidden agenda that he might have in what he's sharing right now with the brothers?
Well, if there were a hidden agenda, we never see it, and we see plenty more of Joseph and the brothers. Right? He welcomes them in. They go back and they get their father, and they are reunited. He gives his brothers a really cushy job and beautiful land to work. Like, he sets them up. He takes care of them. So we don't ever see him do anything to undercut them or to get back at them. So I don't know if there is reason for pessimism seeing this part of the story. Again, maybe earlier of the story, we don't necessarily know where it's going to go. But from this point on, we at least know going forward nothing else happens. Like, there's no reason to question. Other questions? Thoughts? Yeah, Phil.
To me, it seems that revenge was a huge part of what was happening here. Especially when he places the stolen merchandise in one of the bags of the brothers, and then comes upon them and accuses them of stealing. If you call that a test, I mean, that's very questionable as to whether that's a test or whether he really wants to see his brothers convicted, so that they go through. He wants them to experience some of the horror that he experienced. And that's why I said it was that Judah was the pivotal point. You can say that it was all a test. I don't believe that. I believe revenge was a big part of it. And I think that once he got over that when the most heartfelt thing Judah could ever do was to sacrifice his own life. I mean, it seems to me, and that happens with people too sometimes, when they hit rock bottom, is that something has to happen with many people, or else they have to somehow be given that kind of experience, even if it's virtual, to realize that they have to change. The change.
So what I'll say, Phil, is that they're two sides of the same coin, right? He's testing his brothers. If the result of the test is that they're still jerks, then yeah, he's getting, revenge. Like, you're gonna, he'll make their lives miserable. Now, he does want to get revenge on Benjamin, and he does want to get revenge on his father. And he knows that if he were to do anything to Benjamin, it would kill his father, right? So he's not trying to get revenge on either of those. If anything, he just wants to make his other brothers worry a little bit. But again, if they were to make bad choices, he may very well still reveal himself, but just be really disappointed. And thank God that's not what the story that we see. But they don't reveal themselves to be jerks anymore. They clearly have grown and have changed. And so he's able to see, well, they've grown and changed, and I've grown and changed, so we can all kind of move on. Right? He could have just ignored it and continued the rest of his life thinking, my brothers were jerks. If only they could see me now, and look what I've accomplished. But that's not what he does, right? He actually addresses it, and then he actually addresses them. So he's able to proceed from there. So I want to move to another story. This is from the very start of the source sheet. This is page 1. This is the story of Elijah. So you may recall there's a story of Elijah being on Mount Carmel, where there's a prophetic competition. It's Elijah going against all the prophets of Baal. And they're trying to, they build fires, and they call on Baal to start the fire. And if you remember, Baal is like the thunder god, so thunder and lightning. So it would be that, maybe lightning could come down and strike a pile of sticks, and it could catch fire. Right? So, that would be fine. But it doesn't happen. And Elijah comes. Not only does he build the fire, but he builds puts all the sticks and everything for there to be a fire. But then he douses it all in water. And once it's all soaked, then he calls on God, and God brings fire. Right? And he's proven to be this true prophet of the one true God. And then shortly thereafter, all the prophets of Baal are slaughtered. And King Achav and Queen Jezebel, they're not too happy about this. So they want to kill Elijah. They put out a hit on him, essentially. So he starts fleeing. And he flees from Carmel all the way in the north. Within one day, he makes his way down to Beersheba, which is pretty remarkable to be able to get from Carmel to Beersheba in one day on foot. And then he continues for another 40 days and nights until he eventually finds himself at Mount Horeb, another name for Sinai. And there in Mount Horeb, he finds himself a cave, and he hides in the cave. And this is where we pick up. So there, Elijah went into the cave, and there he spent the night. Then the word of Adonai came to him. God said to him, "Why are you here, Elijah?" And Elijah replied, "I am moved by zeal for Adonai, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to the sword. I alone am left, and they are out to take my life. Come out," God called, "and stand on the mountain before Adonai." And lo, Adonai passed by. There was a great and mighty wind, splitting the mountains and shattering rocks by the power of Adonai. But Adonai was not in the wind. After the wind, an earthquake, but Adonai was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake, fire, but Adonai was not in the fire. And after the fire, a soft murmuring sound, or soft, still silence. Right? When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his mantle about his face, and he went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then a voice addressed him, "Why are you here, Elijah?" And Elijah answered, "I am moved by zeal for Adonai, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to the sword. I alone am left, and they are out to take my life." So it goes on from there, and where it goes from there, God says, "All right, so get going. Go back and do what I need to do. You're going to, right? You're going to do whatever it is that you need to." Right. So this is a pretty famous story. I imagine most of you have heard it. But what's going on here? How is he kind of coming to terms with what is his trauma, and how is he coming to terms with his trauma? Any thoughts? Raz or Aaron, Joel? Anybody? Yeah, Phil?
Well, the trauma is that that if he just hung around, they would have been killed. That's pretty traumatic, and he's trying to get away from that, and he finds this cave, and I guess this was Adonai's one of Adonai's caves, and he has this experience of telling God why he's there. He's asked. Interesting that he's asked 2 times, even after there is the wind splitting the mountains and shattering the rocks.
But so what's the difference though? Right. So I'm going to mute you for a second. I just want to see if anybody else picks up on this. So Elijah says the exact same thing twice. But what's the difference between the 2 times that he says it, and what happens in between those 2 times? Yeah, Carol. Yeah.
Well, at one point he was in the cave, then he came out and he said the same thing again. So I wonder what he experienced in the cave
Great.
what he experienced in there and why he said the same thing. It must have meant something different coming out of the cave.
Right. So the first time he's in the cave, says one thing. Second time he's outside of the cave, or at least at the entrance of the cave, but comes out, says the exact same thing. But so what is it that happens then between the 2, right? That makes him go from inside the cave to outside the cave? What does he experience? Right? So there's a mighty wind, splitting mountains, shattering rocks, right? Not in the wind. Then an earthquake, then a fire, and then this kind of stillness called the Mad Udaka, right? This soft and thin or still voice. Right? So what's happening for Elijah? Yeah, Phil.
Well, he's experienced the power of God through these incredible acts. The thing that I find missing, though, is that, and I am going to go out. I am now going to, be courageous because I have now experienced your power firsthand, and I am going to go and become a prophet amongst the people. And maybe that comes later, but it just seems that rather than, or I would have added to.
Wait, I'm going to cut you short because you said something, and it's actually not entirely accurate. You said that he experienced the awesome power of God, but he doesn't, right? It says there's splitting a mountain, shattering rocks, but Adonai was not in the wind, right? Adonai was not those places. Like, that might be the power of God, but he's not finding God in those places. He finds God where? But in the stillness. So there are a couple ways to interpret this, and I think this is actually a very poetic way to interpret it. But when you've gone through a trauma, right, you often will hold within you maybe a lot of anger, right? This wanting to shatter things, wanting to destroy things, wanting to tear things down because you've been torn down in such a way, you want to tear everybody else down with you. Right? And what we see here is that it's only after he gets past all that and he finds himself in this place of stillness, of quiet, of peace, of smallness, right? That is where he's able to find God. Right? Or another way to understand it is that's where he's been able to understand where he came from and kind of come to grips with the trauma that he had. He might say the exact same thing, right? But maybe he says it the first time, I'm moved by the zeal of Adonai, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant. They've torn down your altars. They've put your prophets to the sword. I alone am left, and they're out to take my life. Right? That could be the way that he says it the first time. And then after he gets over all that anger and all that destruction that he wants to cause, and he's calmed and he's centered, and he kind of realizes things, then he says, where are you? Why are you here? I'm moved by zeal. Right? What I see, what I'm seeing isn't good. Right? I've seen them forsake you. They've torn down your altars, and they've put your prophets to the sword. I alone am left. Right? And they're out to take my life. Right? There's nobody else there who can do this. I have to do this. And so what he actually gets is this fresh perspective. Right? He had to, right, we have this idea of fight or flight as a response to trauma. He obviously chose flight. He fled. He got out of there. And it was only once he had fled and he had a chance to kind of get over that anger and be still and possibly introspective that he's then able to then move forward and proceed. It might be the exact same thing that he wants to do. He feels the same way, but he's coming to it from a very different perspective. He's coming to it from this still, quiet perspective and not this raging perspective. And so he faces, right, he stops fleeing and he faces that anger that's within him, and going through that processing allows him to come back out the other side. It actually allows him to come out of that cave, no longer be in flight, but be able to actually address the trauma in front of him. It's this really kind of profound change in him. Right? So we do have time. I want to take us to the final texts here. And this is King David. So we actually went a little out of order chronologically. So most of us know Psalm 23. Right? Though I walk through the valley of shadow of death, I shall fear no evil. Right? So, but what we probably might not know is Psalm 22, which comes right before it. Psalm 22 is actually a not very long psalm. Psalm 119 is much longer. But Psalm 22 is 30 some verses, where Psalm 23 is only several verses. But I wanted to pick some of the key language from Psalm 22, so you really get a sense of who is David, what's he experiencing immediately before we then read the text of Psalm 23. So for the leader on Ayelet HaShachar, a Psalm of David, and Ayelet HaShachar, it's very strange. Why this idea of Ayelet HaShachar? And rabbis have a lot of conversations about it, but one of the most beautiful explanations is that Ayelet HaShachar is supposedly one of the names of the morning star. And the morning star being like that first bit of light, letting you know that the new day is dawning, giving you that sense of hope. And there's a lot of hope within this text itself here. Right? But I am a worm, less than human, scorned by men, despised by people. All who seek me mock me. They curl their lips, they shake their heads. Let him commit himself to Adonai. Let him rescue him. Let God save him, for God is pleased with him. Many bulls surround me. Mighty ones of Bashan encircle me. They open their mouths at me like tearing, roaring lions. My life ebbs away. All my bones are disjointed. My heart is like wax melting within me. My vigor dries up like a shard. My tongue cleaves to my palate. You commit me to the dust of death. Dogs surround me. A pack of evil ones closes in on me. Like lions, they maul my hands and feet. I take the count of all my bones while they look on and gloat. They divide my clothes amongst themselves, casting lots for my garments. But you, O Lord, be not far off. My strength, hasten to my aid. Save my life from the sword, my precious life from the clutches of a dog. Deliver me from a lion's mouth, from the horns of wild oxen. Rescue me. Then will I proclaim your fame to my brethren. Praise you in the congregation. So we see he is freaking out. They are closing in on him. His days are numbered. Right? His reign is soon over. They're going to kill him. Whatever's going to happen. He knows that he is in a tough spot. He wants God there. He calls out to God. God doesn't answer, right? But he holds on to the sense of hope that God will be there. And then we get to Psalm 23. Adonai is my shepherd, I shall not want. God makes me lie down in green pastures and leads me beside still waters. God renews my soul and guides me in paths of righteousness for God's name's sake. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup runs over. Surely goodness and loving kindness shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of Adonai forever. And so what we have here is also this place of this sense of stillness, right? This laying down in green pastures, being led beside still waters. We have this feeling of him being completely alone in wilderness. And you can imagine if the last scene, Psalm 22, if that was the last scene in a film of him running away from some battle, terrified that everybody is trying to try to kill him, they're trying to get him, and he's run away, and all of a sudden how he finds himself in this beautiful open field and nobody's around. And there's a stream that he wanders down to, and you can imagine he's kind of maybe leaning his hand over and just running his fingers across the surface of the water. Maybe he leans down and picks up some water to drink. Right? And he finds himself in this place of a surety and comfort, and realizes that there's all this blessing in his life. And he realizes that if he follows on this path that he's so committed to, then he'll actually find that strength. And it doesn't matter if people mock him for it. He's able to move on and to have success. And we obviously know what happens to King David. He prevails until the end of his life, which is by natural causes, and he does quite well for himself. But this idea of needing to kind of get into that flight and going away from that flight, but getting to this place of stillness where he can then look back and reflect on what it is that is the problem. And from there, he's able to then kind of find God again and find his comfort in who he is and what he's trying to do. It's it's a profound process that he goes through, and obviously it's a pretty terrifying process as well. Having not just other people want to kill you, but having armies trying to hunt you down and kill you, and not being able to trust any of the people within your courts, and being paranoid, but for very good reason. It's a terrible, traumatic experience for him to go through, and yet he comes out of it even more sure of himself, and he retires in a way. He ages quite peacefully and without that concern anymore. So, yeah, Ross. Yeah.
Except that David is a very fraught character. You could almost say, in fact, I heard a sermon on this subject once, that God seems to love him beyond his deserts and let him get away with a lot of stuff. The Bathsheba episode is one example, but there are others.
I think what we have here,
So it's almost kind of like he's a manic depressive. And you can kind of see that in these two Psalms too.
I don't know if I would call him manic depressive, because we don't see him depressive elsewhere. I think what we see in his youth, married to someone who was cruel to him. He was married to Michal, the daughter of Saul, and she was cruel to him. She mocked him. She didn't love him. She was ashamed of him. And right, she grew up in the palace, and he was a shepherd, right? And she looked at him like some, hillbilly in a way. And yeah, and obviously he became in his youth drunk on power, and realized, well, I don't have this woman who wants me, but here's this other woman who wants me, and maybe she does, maybe she doesn't, but there's a husband in the way, so let's take care of that. And he messes up, and then he makes tshuva for it as well. And the idea is that we're all flawed people, and in fact, every single figure in the Tanakh is tragically flawed. But we don't see a craziness or a mania in him. We see somebody who has been through quite a lot as well. Right, the youngest, the smallest of Jesse's kids, and here he is, and he's lifted up to be this Mashiach, right? This savior of the people. So what I think we see through these three texts, and really, which going back to Phil's original question, so we're going from this trauma of Pesach to Mount Sinai, which in and of itself is a pretty traumatic experience as well. Right? The shaking of the ground, and the lightning and the thunder and the fire and the smoke, and everybody's freaking out. In fact, when the Israelites hear the Ten Commandments, they say to Moses, please stop, make God stop. You talk to God directly. It's actually too much for us. And so they only get the Ten Commandments, and then the rest of the commandments are given to Moses directly, and Moses relays them to the people. So, but what we see here, though, is that the very first thing that happens in being able to develop the communal relationship with God through Torah, the very first thing is they have to address what they're coming from. They're reminded of their trauma. The very first thing, I am Adonai who brought you out of the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage. The very first thing they can do before they can enter into this new relationship, this new perspective, is address where they came from. And I think that's really what we see as this process throughout all of them. Yosef kind of, in a way, fled involuntarily, but he fled. It was only when he was able to turn back and directly address his past was he then able to gain a new perspective. Eliyahu, he fled, and when he was able to pause and be still and look inward and get over whatever anger he had, right, then he is able to step out and continue with the task that he was supposed to do. And King David, overwhelmed and fleeing, finally finds himself in this place of stillness and realizes his holding out to hope wasn't foolish. He can do this. He can move forward. The rabbis say the Torah was given they say it's like a hammer striking a stone, right, and sending all these sparks everywhere. That the idea is that everybody received Torah in their own way. 70 different languages, meaning infinite languages in the world. They said the Torah was given in 70 languages. The idea that Torah means different things to every single person. You may believe in God, you may not believe in God. You may desire a relationship with God, you might not desire a relationship with God. Right? But this idea of having a new perspective, having a new understanding, having a new direction in your life, that's what I think Torah is standing in for. And a way to be able to get there, not to be able to get there not the only way, but a way to be able to get to that new place, if you're coming from a place of trauma, is to be able to look backwards, not to run from, not to ignore, not to hide from that trauma, but to face it and to look at it and to struggle with it. And then when you come out of it and you've done all that, not only are you healthier and more able to move forward, but you possibly even have a new perspective. You've gained a new Torah. And I'll tell you for myself, without getting into the details of everything that I went through, but having gone through the process of addressing my trauma, I then came back afterwards and I started looking at the Torah in a completely new perspective. I started seeing stories in a way that I never looked at them before. And I realized that there was a new part of me that I had uncovered, that I had let rise up to the surface, that allowed me to be able to engage with Torah in a completely different way. And I think one of the reasons why we are so obsessed with talking about the trauma of Egypt is to help us actually deal with whatever traumas maybe we've experienced in our own lives. Every single morning, we get up and we talk about Egypt. We look at Shirat Hayam and this idea of leaving Mitzrayim. And we say the Shema and we remind ourselves of God freeing us from Egypt. Right? And it's so much language of redemption. And then on Shabbat, Zecher Yetziat Mitzrayim. This is a way to remember leaving Egypt. All these times, we're supposed to be looking at that trauma. And if we ignore it, we can't appreciate this new thing that we have, this blessing of Torah, this blessing of Shabbat, all the blessings in our lives. And one way to understand that experience, that collective experience, is to understand how it can affect us individually. That if we too look at our Mitzrayims, whatever our traumas are, and we address them, then we can actually proceed with this great new gift of Torah, whatever it is, however it is that we understand it and hold it and cherish it. So, so as we're getting ready to receive Torah, there's still plenty of time if you want to be able to just look back at your Egypt as we count these last days of the Omer. So, any questions? Any thoughts? Yeah, Phil.
A couple of ideas. One, I'm reminded of the Unatana Tokef, the still small voice inside. When you talk about the still small voice that, in a way, King David and also Elijah accessed apparently, and were able to somehow find God within themselves, I think, which an important concept. And then we're assuming that they acted upon that there was a result. I find it problematic in the Shavuot, as you explained, that there it was the thunder and the lightning and the words. So powerful was that experience that they saw. They saw with their ears and they heard with their eyes. It mixed up their senses. How does one go from that into a coming to the still small voice inside? That's my first point. My second one is, I think it'd be interesting for you to talk. Oh, I'm sorry.
Before you go to the second point, let's look at the first point. So how do you go from that traumatic experience of Sinai? And I think in a way, God messed up in a way, right? That here are these people who are very timid and afraid. And I think God's approach was, well, you think those people were really strong? Don't worry about it. I've got your back, and look how strong and awesome I am. And in a way, it really just frightened them more into hiding, where they say, Moses, please, you take over for us. We can't do this. We can't listen to this. And then we see what happens is that they spent all this time wandering through a desert. They remained very timid people. But that being said, they still received Torah. They still entered into a relationship with God. Right? They still were presented with this gift this guidance of how to live their lives. They didn't know what they were doing with their lives, and they didn't know to where they were going. And all of a sudden, they were actually given direction. So the experience of Sinai may have been traumatic, but it wasn't necessarily traumatic. Like, it was not, trauma wasn't done to them, right? I think it was more than anything else, it was just overwhelming. And I think the way that was presented was unnecessarily overwhelming for that group of people. But that being said, it had a obviously profound, lasting impact for thousands of years. So maybe in that way, it actually God actually filled God's purpose by having it sustain. That being said, right, being overwhelmed in that experience of Sinai put aside, they did go from this trauma of Egypt into now having this new relationship, this new direction, this Torah in their hands, which they didn't have before. And they couldn't have had it before. They literally could not have had Torah prior to this, because they didn't have freedom. They didn't have the ability to be able to choose to take this, right? They could have said, no, we don't want it, right? But they now were able to face their trauma and said, yes, okay, we can do it, and we can get out of there. Yeah, Aaron.
So I want to go back to something that Phil had said before when he was talking about sort of like this theory of revenge, right? And to me, that there's themes that I can't get out of my head that Judaism seems to have just a total and utter obsession with. And I think the term isn't revenge. I think it's justice. I think that it's tzedakah, right? So he's trying to make a judgment as to what sort of justice is appropriate under the circumstance, more than he is trying to say, ha ha ha, you guys are still bad people, or I'm going to catch you in using a bad term or something like that. So to me, I really thought of it as you were talking. I felt that it was much more in the lines of the seeking of justice rather than revenge.
And I'll say, people who have been attacked, whatever type of trauma has been inflicted upon, if trauma has been inflicted by another upon you, it is very difficult to be able to look at that person or individuals without looking at them slightly, askance, or to get a sense of, like, are they actually the same person? Like, they may have said they apologize. Maybe they actually did apologize, but did they actually really apologize? Are they the same person? Are they going to hurt me again? And right, so there is a sense of wanting to kind of test those waters, and I think and there are plenty of people who forgive their attackers for whatever reason it might be, right? And so I think that's what we see Joseph doing as well, which is he's ready to be able to forgive, but he wants to make sure that they're deserving of that forgiveness, right? Which is, right, you could just forgive blanketly, which is fine, and it's a very noble thing to do. It's a very difficult thing for most people to be able to do. And so you need some sense of, like, okay, what can I do to be able to forgive? And oftentimes it's that need of justice, right? Like, you see people, parents of someone who was killed sitting in court, and they are able to forgive their child's killer, because on one level, that person's now in prison and they're serving time, and they are, like, paying for their actions. So why do you need to hold on to any more hatred? Or, right? It's beautiful when people are able to do that, but it's an incredibly difficult thing for people to do. Other questions, thoughts, reflections? Yeah, Joel.
Yes, Rabbi, very enlightening. Thank you. Now, do you see any connection between what you have just described with the Geula, the exile, and also in Shavua, Book of Ruth, with the Redeemer? Like, I kind of see a parallel throughout history, how we're going through the same process that you have just described so eloquently to me. What's your thoughts?
The idea of can you say more? I mean, so the idea of Boaz being there to to redeem how? Like, what are you? I mean,
Well, okay, the book of Judges, when we look across it, we see that the Jewish people are constantly getting into trouble and then being brought back from that. And we ourselves, right now, the Goylos of Yovan, we're just so far away. We're in a bad place, but we're going to be redeemed. We're going to come back, and we're going to be at one with God in the future. And we're seeing that throughout history. And maybe we can get through these difficult times a little better with the thought that we're going to see things differently. What's your thought?
so I learned a word this week. Uh, Agathism, I think, is the word. Agathism is it's similar to optimism. It's the idea that eventually things are going to get better, but it may be very difficult to get there. And this idea of, and I see this similar, this idea of being redeemed as this idea that things will get better. In a way, if you look at the story of Ruth, right, she also was given the option to flee. After her husband died and after her brother-in-law died, she and her sister-in-law were both given the option of going back to their respective homes, and the sister-in-law chose to do so, and Ruth chose to stay with Naomi, and she wasn't even looking for another husband or anything else. She just decided, I'm going to stay here. She didn't necessarily want to leave that. And what happens is she gets, having gone through that and having chosen not to run from it, she then kind of, not that she's rewarded with, but she opens herself up to the possibility of this beautiful future with Boaz, instead of with Ploni Almoni, because who wants to marry a guy named Ploni Almoni? But this idea of, right, maybe it's the idea that when you address that trauma, you open yourself up, right? And so in the case of the Israelites in Sinai, they address it and they open themselves up to receiving Torah, and and Yosef addresses it and he opens himself up to seeing a path forward for survival. And actually, I think really, if you're looking at all of them, in each case is really a path forward for survival, right? You open yourself up to that path forward, right? So Ruth opens herself up to that path forward and the survival or the continuation by then having, children and having, and eventually, descendant being King David, I think her great grandson, right? And we see David himself opening himself up to a path forward to continue his reign. And Eliyahu sees a path forward to be able to continue his service of God. And maybe part of the idea is because we are so obsessed as a people with the trauma of our past, whether it's the trauma of Egypt, whether it's the trauma of Babylonian exile, whether it's the trauma of Khorban, of destruction of the temple, whether it's the trauma of the Inquisition or the pogroms or the Shoah, right? We constantly are turning to them and we're facing them and we're addressing them. And by doing so, we open ourselves up to the possibility of some path forward. We don't necessarily know what the path forward is, but we open ourselves up. And that's kind of the revelation. When we find it, it's like, we found it, right? And so if you're the slaves and you've left Egypt and you're just, you're broken, but then you all of a sudden look around and you're able to address it, then you've opened yourself up to this path forward. And the Torah gave them that path forward. It gave them the groundwork to be able to set up their own society, completely different from the society they had been in, one that's going to be more filled with justice, as Aaron was saying. And so I think maybe that's kind of the connection there, which is that if you just see the trauma and you run from it, and right, you never come back to address it, then you don't ever open yourself up to what could be there in front of you. You remain kind of in this sheltered, broken place. So maybe that's the connection there. Yeah, Carol.
You know, it's obvious that we all are in a collective Egypt right now. And, you know, we kind of, with the sheltering in place, have been in our own caves, some liking it, others fighting against it. And the coming out is almost more traumatic than the going in, not knowing how the coming out is going to manifest itself, and then what are the repercussions from the coming out. And I think we do have to listen to the still small voice really every day, just to kind of function and to stay in the present while we take baby steps into the future. And, you know, I have no doubt that everybody in their own ways will be a changed individual, let's say looking forward 2 years from now, and seeing how we've all changed in this period of time, if we're fortunate to be able to physically survive the virus.
And I'll tell you, I keep a very close eye on my child to see how this may be affecting her, and if it's, you know, leading to any like serious, deep-seated trauma, and wondering about how we will have to address it in the future, so that she doesn't get bogged down in fear and worry, and it's a very serious concern that we should have for everybody. But the one way we're not going to be able to move forward is if we just ignore it and pretend like it doesn't happen. We have to be able to look at the experience and reflect on it, so that we can be able to move forward. We've been here for an hour, so I want. Oh yeah, Aaron. Yes, you got the last point here, buddy.
Yeah, so I just wanted to mention just a couple interesting things on tonight. If you wanted to go and dig into some of that past trauma, on PBS, it's like Jewish hour from 7 o'clock until, well, I don't. This is Arizona time, so I'm assuming PBS is going to have the same programming. But there's Finding Your Roots tonight, another show called Viral Anti-Semitism and Four Mutations, and then Frontline is having a program on the last survivors, the last Holocaust survivors. So that's all on PBS tonight, that at least in Arizona.
Uplifting stuff.
Yeah.
But you know, it's about addressing all that. So actually, I do want to say as well. So we have on Thursday night. It's not only LA and Southern California. There are even some other states, but there are a number of communities coming together for some learning. Also including the Ziegler School for Rabbinic Studies, I believe in association also with the Rabbinical Assembly. So it starts as early as 4 p.m. On Thursday, and then it goes, but like the main sessions themselves start around 8 o'clock, and it goes until past midnight. So check that out. The link is jewitathome.com, and you can find the information on Mishkon's website as well. But a lot of different sessions, so check out the offerings, and you have to register for the sessions. But yeah, but please, you know, come check that out. And no Friday night service, because it's going to be Yontif, and we're not doing any Ma'ariv. We've only been doing Kabbalat Shabbat, and there's no Kabbalat Shabbat on Friday night. Saturday morning will include Hallel and Yizkor and everything. Just no, obviously we don't take out the Torah, but I'll read the Parsha and everything else we've been doing. That's at 10 o'clock on Saturday morning. And we're no longer doing Havdalah, as it's getting later and later at night this time of year. So we won't be doing Havdalah again probably till August or so. So we still have, I think, Talmud with tea tomorrow with Rabbi Dan, and otherwise, you know, Shavuot. So I hope everybody enjoys your cheesecake or blintzes or whatever it is that you eat. And I'll talk to you all later. Have a